Okay, thank you so much, Ivona, for the kind introduction and for the invitation, of course, and thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. Can you understand me in the back? Okay, cool. So I'm really looking forward to this talk and to the discussion. This is really work in progress. So it's, as Ivona said, it's based on a recently concluded research project of mine, a Thyssen-funded research project, which explored the use of advanced genetic modification techniques in insect synthetic biology. And I was especially interested in ways through which life is not only turned into a public health technology or a public health tool, but also a sort of novel source for capital accumulation. So the research project basically, and also my talk today, is set against the backdrop of insights which the sociologist Nicholas Rose stressed over 2 decades ago. Rose pointed out that innovations in molecular biology increasingly translate what Foucault has termed biopolitics into biocapitalism, with the consequence that human biological existence becomes political in novel ways. Now, in his work, Rose has been especially interested in the question of how human life becomes, quote, the object, target, and stake of this new vital politics, end quote. While this idea has gained a reputation under the banner of a politics of life itself, the discussion it sparked usually or often remained limited to the governance of human life. And what is more, and this is in fact the starting point, or this was the starting point for my research project, it left death largely out of the picture. Now, it is true that death is not in the same way the object of political and economic rationalities as life or life itself is. But does this mean that the appropriation, economization, and also governance, maybe in a sense, of death is so insignificant that it requires no further conceptual consideration? And in what ways does the manipulation of life or the life forms to produce value, not only out of vitality, but also out of death and even potentially eradication of entire species, might impact our understanding of labor and value? So guided by these questions in this talk, I will turn to 2 recent cases of synthetically produced life forms. I'm not sure, maybe some of you have heard of them. The first one is Oxford Insect Technologies friendly trademark Aedes mosquito, and the other one is Target Malaria's gene-drive mosquito. So by exploring how the death of non-human beings is mobilized to enhance human health, I will address the critical questions of who must die and how, so that others may live, and what forms of value are thereby generated. So my talk is set out as follows. I first introduce both engineered organisms in detail and argue that synthetic biology is not only producing new knowledge about life processes, but also appropriates and utilizes death on a molecular scale in novel ways. And then discuss the concept of biovalue while also exploring its limitations. As I will demonstrate, not only life itself, but also death has become the target of economic and political relations in novel ways. And finally, I will turn to the debate on animal capital and animal labor and argue that the engineered organisms in question are not only living or lively commodities, but also perform what I call metabolic death work, or metabolic death labor, if you want, in order to generate a specific form of biovalue, which I have termed necrovalue. So driven by the increasing resistance of mosquitoes to insecticides, which is diminishing the effectiveness of conventional chemicals and chemical control methods, recent years have seen significant progress in developing synthetically produced organisms for public health purposes, but also for vector control purposes. These novel genetic strategies often aimed at exploiting the insect's own biology and reproductive capabilities in order to transform them into living public health tools which are tasked with eradicating their own species. What we can witness here is a shift where mosquitoes, which traditionally are viewed as vectors of death, are becoming agents of their own death and even the eradication of the members of their own species or the populations of their own species. Oxitex-friendly Aedes and target malaria's gene-drive mosquito are two examples for this shift. So founded as a spin-off from the University of Oxford, Oxitex specializes in creating genetically modified insects and also mosquitoes especially with so-called self-limiting genes, which is a technology designed to suppress mosquito populations by preventing their offspring from reaching adulthood. So they basically die in the larval stage. So Oxitex first conducted field trials with genetically modified mosquitoes in the Cayman Island. I think that was in 2008. But large-scale operational use was only achieved after the devastating Zika virus epidemic in Brazil in 2015, 2016. And since then, Oxitex has released billions of its self-limiting Aedes mosquitoes, branded as friendly, trademark Aedes in Brazil, but also in other regions, in the Florida Keys, which is where I did my field research, in California, in, I think, Burkina Faso, in Panama, and the Cayman Islands. So in the same year, in 2015, Oxitex was also acquired by Precigen, which is a synthetic biology corporation. And this expansion basically led to the creation of their second generation friendly trademark Aedes mosquito. And the transition from like the earlier model of life or mosquito is described by Oxitex CEO Gray Franson as going, quote, "From the equivalent of the original Model T car, innovative and groundbreaking in its day, to a self-driving electric car in just a few years," end quote. So what strikes us here is that friendly Aedes is promoted as a commercially marketable technology comparable to the automobile. So this analogy becomes evident, or even more salient actually, when we consider that these mosquitoes are produced in small assembly line inspired batches and then shipped to customers and mosquito control units all around the world. One might say that this completes more or less a historical circle. So from Henry Ford's pioneering assembly line, originally inspired by the disassembly line, of Cincinnati's early 20th century slaughterhouses, back to its roots actually in the animal body. But this time, the animals are not disassembled, but basically redesigned on a molecular level. So what makes Oxitex-friendly Aedes of the second generation unique, however, is not only the fact that it is life turned into a technology, which is commodified, but also that it participates in the work of its own eradication, or the eradication of its own species. So the organisms are produced by micro-injecting mosquito eggs with recombinant DNA. The inserted genes are basically synthetically manufactured, but an Oxitex lab technician said, quote, "The inspiration is based on working systems found in organisms from nature, from which sequences are available in DNA databases," end quote. So the inserted genetic construct includes a lethal operator gene, which basically works in a way that in the presence of a specific antibiotic, tetracycline, the organisms survive. And in the absence of tetracycline, this lethal gene is expressed, which leads to the death of the transgenic mosquito and also its offspring, which inherits this gene. So after the female papae, which is in insect cell stage between larva and the adult insect, are removed and killed, the lab technicians only release the non-biting male adult transgenic mosquitoes into the environment so that they can reproduce with like wild-type mosquitoes. And they only release the males because they are also like designing the design mosquitoes come in both genders, but they don't want to release like more biting mosquitoes because only the female mosquitoes are the ones who bite, and only in specific time periods because when they need blood for their young. So that's the reason why they only release males. So while Oxitex campaigns that its technology is entirely changing the fight against vector-borne diseases, the research consortium Target Malaria takes a somewhat more modest position by stressing that the goal is to provide complementary tools in fighting malaria. So in contrast to Zika and dengue, Malaria is not a virus, but a disease caused by protozoan parasites of the genus Plasmodium. Transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes into the blood of its host. The parasites basically move into the liver and can cause fever, yellow skin, seizures, and in severe cases, also death due to liver dysfunction. And according to the WHO, in 2003 alone, malaria has resulted in, I think, 630,000 deaths worldwide, or at least more than 600,000 deaths, which is why the African Union expects that, quote, without additional complementary interventions, the target for malaria elimination by 2030 will not be achieved. Hence the need to explore emerging technologies such as gene drive technology for malaria control and elimination, end quote, is considered imperative. So as the parasite forms a symbiotic relation with Anopheles mosquitoes, the most successful way to tackle the disease is basically in not aiming at the parasite, but its host, which is the Anopheles mosquito, host and vector. And this is precisely what Target Malaria does, or strives to do. In 2019, the research consortium partnered with the Institut de Recherche en Sciences de la Santé in Burkina Faso to conduct field trials with the engineered mosquitoes. So they basically developed adapted, genetically engineered or modified variant of the Anopheles mosquito, which was then maintained under laboratory conditions for further study, and then later in that year released in Burkina Faso. And this initial release was not meant to release a gene-drive mosquito. It was actually just to study how these mosquitoes survive and how they reproduce and pass on the edited genome. So the reason why they didn't do it yet, but will do it in the near future, is that synthetic gene drives are genetic elements that can bias their own inheritance, which causes them to become prevalent in a population over successive generations. So unlike traditional inheritance, which where genes are has a 50% chance of being passed to the next generation, gene drives increase the probability of a specific gene becoming inherited. So, and this is achieved through mechanisms such as CRISPR-Cas9 based systems. These systems basically cut the chromosome at a pre-selected level. When the organism tries to repair the cut, the genome is spliced, or the edited genome is actually, the CRISPR is actually spliced into the genome. And what Target Malaria actually want to do with this technique is that they're planning to release a mosquito based on a technique they call autosomal X shredder, which basically disrupts the transmission of the paternal X chromosome. And this is expected to generate fertile mosquito strains that produce over 95% male offspring. So only male offspring is produced so long until they don't find like a female mosquito to reproduce and the species basically dies out. So in contrast to Oxitec's self-limiting gene that gradually declines in the population and also in the environment before it is completely eliminated out of the environment, these self-sustaining gene-drive mosquitoes, once released, can autonomously propagate the desired genetic modifications. And it is actually for this reason why Target Malaria already anticipates the suppression of malaria-transmitting Anopheles gambia mosquitoes in sub-Saharan Africa within the next decade, or by 2030 was the original idea. Now, typically, life in biology, or in biological terms at least, is seen as a series of processes that maintain an organism's structure and function, fundamentally resisting entropy and delaying death. Here, however, both organisms are created to work towards death. So what we can encounter is synthetically engineered life that aims at driving the extinction of entire species. And despite the relevance of such organisms to biopolitical and or at least bioeconomic projects and their analyses, there has been little attention to the question I want to raise in this talk, namely how animal bodies are put to work through novel genetic strategies and how death is utilized and also, in a sense, maybe valued, both economically but also otherwise in these processes. So some of you might be familiar with the notion of bio-value, I guess. Catherine Waldby introduced it 2 decades ago, I think, or 2000, or more than 2 decades ago, to highlight how biological substances and life forms, such as genes or stem cells or tissue cultures, can gain economic value in biotechnological and medical contexts. So turning to the Visible Human Project, which was an initiative by the US National Library of Medicine in the early 1990s, I think, to create first detailed 3-dimensional representations of the human body through the digital dissection of human corpses. Waldby basically explored the potential that biological materials have for generating value in various forms, and also for different enterprises in science, in industry, but also in medicine. And in doing so, Waldby extended Foucault's notion of biopolitics, which is concerned with the regulation of life processes in bodies and in populations, by focusing on the technologies, the practices, and also the rationalities through which living processes are transformed into calculable and exploitable forms of value. Waldby's work has been echoed in a rich debate on the economization of life that followed. Most prominently, Nicholas Rose expanded Waldby's notion to bio-value, quote, in a wider sense to refer to all the ways in which vitality itself has become the potential source of value, quote. For Rose, this development is paralleled by a fundamental reconfiguration of biopolitics to what he terms molecular biopolitics. So while Foucault's understanding of biopolitics operated on the level of the population and the individual body, molecular biopolitics refers to the ways in which life itself is governed and manipulated at the molecular level. So according to Rose, this molecular focus represents a significant shift in the life sciences from a molar understanding of the body, meaning as collections of organs or systems, to a perspective that regards life as composed of dynamic, mobile, manipulable elements. And resulting from this fundamental reorganization, he says, a new language has emerged that treats life itself as reprogrammable information, as a set of processes that can be modulated, managed, and also controlled at the molecular level. Now, in the past few years, the concept of bio-value has gained considerable traction and has become an important part of the discussion about the value of a living biological material. However, while these analyses of the politicization of life itself and the ways it is transformed into capital have given rise to a lively debate, death only plays a rather subordinate role in them. It is either taken for granted and given no further attention, or it appears to be merely a necessary byproduct of the practices and technologies of increasing vitality for the purpose of its economic exploitation. So for example, when stem cells, organs, or other living material is removed from fetuses and human corpses for therapeutical or other medical purposes. And this is remarkable given that Catherine Waldby already stressed that the boundaries of death are constantly breached and reconfigured through new forms of technogenesis, through new ways of producing bio-value at the margins of living processes. So while the commodification of life itself and its transformation into speculative surplus value has become the subject of much needed analyses, something similar has yet to be done for death and the way in which it can be subjected to basically the logic of financialization and also value production. And both synthetically produced mosquitoes I just introduced are paradigmatic cases pointing toward a reconfiguration of contemporary biocapitalism, which creates more and more mechanisms to exploit death and dying as a resource. These mechanisms transform what is traditionally seen as the end of economic productivity into a site of value generation, because death here plays a fundamental role as it basically becomes both the desired goal, but also a source of value. So if it's true that the central axis of the commodification of life is, quote, that vital or generative qualities of the animal commodity are seen as fundamental to valorization, productive of capitalist value as long as they remain alive and or promise future life, end quote, as human geographer Man Barua argues, then both organisms, or both engineered organisms, in fact, challenge this very idea. Because while the mosquitoes are still life, that is produced and that remain alive, this is only to enable them to fulfill their purpose, which precisely lies in their death or in their self-eradication as a species and in the creation of value out of the death. So without a doubt, friendly Aedes and target malaria's gene-drive mosquitoes are life that has been instrumentalized. But there are also more than that. There are living beings that perform work, although a specific form of work that amounts to their own death. So while the idea that animals can perform work has long been viewed critically in Marxist context, mainly because Marx said that only human beings can work or perform labor by consciously acting on nature and by selling their labor to the capitalist who exploits them. In recent years, a significant work of body emerged, which challenges this idea and which explores how animals, under specific contexts, perform labor-like actions, which are or how animals and their work might also, or is constantly actually brought in the realm of capital. And two proposals in particular stand out from this body of work, which seeks to link the debate on bio-value with Marx-inspired critique of the political economy. So in a particular striking way, Man Barua, human geographer, I think from Oxford University, explores the unrecognized economic significance of the work animals can perform. So Barua distinguishes basically three ways which animals and their bodies can contribute to accumulation or capitalist accumulation, metabolic labor, ecological labor, and affective labor. So metabolic labor refers to the ways in which animals' biological processes are harnessed for economic gains. For example, cows producing milk or chickens laying eggs. Ecological labor, on the other hand, refers to the role of animals in maintaining ecosystems, which are critical for human economic activities. For example, bees as pollinators, who pollinate crops for agriculture. And in fact, I think 1/3 of the global agriculture depends on bees or other insects as pollinators. And finally, the third category would be affective labor, which refers to emotional labor. Animals can do or perform in, for instance, in industries like zoos or in therapy. And then he says that these three categories are basically also allow us to enable, quote, enable a critical exegesis of what Marx famously called the hidden adobe of production, as well as the realm of reproduction beyond it, end quote. So in a crucial sense, Barua's analysis disrupts the traditional Marxist distinction between constant and variable capital, because in Marxist terms, constant capital refers to the physical means of production, which is machinery or tools, raw materials, which would be animals for Marx, while variable capital refers to, for example, human labor, which is seen as the source of surplus value. Now, Barua's concept of animal labor challenges, in a sort, this dichotomy by showing that animals can function as both lively commodities and as laborers within the production process. For instance, it says a dairy cow is both a source of commodities, which would be milk, and the laboring body whose biological processes of reproduction are integral for milk production. So for Barua, this dual role complicates this traditional Marxist category and suggests that animals can contribute to the creation of value within capitalist economies. Aiming at the animal labor theory of value, also social theorist Dinesh Vadivel stresses that the question is not whether animals labor, but rather, quote, whether animals in productive processes produce value in ways that is different from what accounted for by Marx, end quote. So pointing to the example of the chicken harvesting machine, which mechanizes the production of collecting chickens for slaughter, Bodywell argues that chickens are not only objects of labor or raw materials, but also subjects whose movements, resistances, and biological rhythms influence the efficiency and profitability of the harvesting process. So Bodywell takes into account something that is often unrecognized or ignored in arguments against a animal theory of labor or animal labor theory of value, namely the way in which animal life intersects with the temporality of capitalist production. So the biological rhythms of animals, their growth rates, their life cycles, but also their ability to resist in a variety of ways are crucial factors in determining the pace and efficiency of the production process. So for example, the time it takes for a chicken to reach adulthood or slaughter weight is a critical determinant of the profitability of poultry farming. So in this sense, animals' biological time is a key component of the labor process and by extension of value production. And this temporal dimension of animal labor sort of complicates traditional Marxist categories, which tend to focus on human labor as the sole metric of value. So now these critical interventions should not be understood as claiming that animals perform work of their own accord, or that the biological functions of life itself should already be considered as labor. Yeah. So instead, they transcend the anthropocentric limitations of Marxist theories of labor by emphasizing that the work that animals perform in specific contexts is always porous and performed together with other human and non-human beings. So not only is animal labor, like basically any labor, a fundamentally relational matter, animals, as Barla reminds us, also, quote, do not naturally become laborers, and non-human divisions of labor are not default, no more than people naturally sell their labor. Rather, an active history of expropriation and exploitation is at play, which forges the very conditions for the category of non-human labor to emerge, end quote. So seeing in this light, both cases of engineered mosquitoes introduced before illustrate that capital positions these animals in a unique way, namely as both means of production and as laboring bodies. So meaning the mosquitoes function as variable and constant capital at the same time. They are, as Bodywell writes, a special raw material that circulates, that enters production as one commodity and leaves as another, and can be relied upon to labor upon themselves through their own metabolic processes and thus produce value with production process, end quote. So in other words, instead of being merely raw material for the production, these insects perform work. And insofar this work is directed towards their own death and the death of their own species, actually, I propose in this talk that the metabolic work that they perform could be basically called like a metabolic death work. So making the mosquitoes, and this is basically from Brazil, the engineered mosquitoes are usually just thrown out from like plastic canisters from a van into like the neighborhoods. And these mosquitoes are basically made hostage to their own reproductive and metabolic labor because the animal bodies and their reproduction becomes part and parcel of an accumulation strategy which aims at producing value. So for this reason, it is by no means only metaphorical when Mustapha de Bon, who is an entomologist and also the general manager of the Delta Mosquito Vector Control District, says, quote, the eggs of friendly Aedes will hatch into larvae. The larvae, of course, develop into male mosquitoes, and then they go and do the job for us. I don't need a technician anymore. Out there, the mosquitoes will do the job for us, end quote. Now, if these organisms perform work, the question arises whether they also produce value. And if so, what sort of value? And it would be misguided to ascribe work, and even more so value production, to basically life processes per se. For example, by claiming that molecules or trees labor and generate value by simply existing or living or metabolizing even. So value does not arise by itself, but is, as I said, a fundamentally relational phenomenon. However, it would be also equally short-sighted to assume that the two synthetically produced mosquitoes are merely appropriated nature, plain commodities which add nothing to the process of value creation. Instead, as Barua and Vadivel would say, whom I follow here, a dual role in the production process can be witnessed, similar to the described food animals. These mosquitoes basically act as raw material that is transformed into a product and then also sold, at least in the case of Oxitec. But at the same time, they also provide the labor that must work on itself through metabolic self-generation and reproduction in order to halt reproduction, which is also very paradoxical because they reproduce so that reproduction of the species can be stopped. So on the one hand, as to use Stefan Helmreich's helpful formula of biocapital, life is fashioned into a commodity here through laboratory work, which produces biocapital at the end of this process. And indeed, Oxitec advertises friendly ADAs as straightforwardly as actually a living pesticide and a living public health tool, placing the reference to its status as a trademark, symbolically in the front of the genus name of friendly, illustrates the hybrid status of these animals as commodities and as living creatures, as products and producers, as still alive and also already working towards their own death. So friendly ADAs, here you can see a clip from Brazil. Friendly ADAs actually shipped to households. You can buy these boxes to businesses, to municipals in a dried state. So the eggs are basically dried in the production facilities or factories, and then they're shipped in these containers. Then you always had to add water to the eggs. So they are brought from their liminal stage of like being neither dead nor alive, but in a dried state. And then they hatch and go out and do the job. So since the area in which the genetically modified mosquitoes perform the work is rather limited, which is because mosquitoes only survive for a couple of days and they only move, I think, 3 to 5 kilometers in their entire life, you have to constantly release new mosquitoes so that the effect can be measured. And this basically makes it also to a business model for Oxitec because the mosquitoes have to be released continuously in order to suppress them. So but the case of target malaria is a bit more complicated because, or in the generation of economic value at least, it can nonetheless be understood as a philanthropic capitalist project, which in addition to reducing the high number of deaths caused by mosquito-transmitted diseases, also promises to reduce the economic losses that mosquitoes indirectly have on economies. So according to Endai Sal, Global Communications Officer of Target Malaria, quote, 90% reduction in case incidence by 2030 could result in an improvement of $142.7 billion in the gross domestic product, GDP, of malaria endemic countries. International trade would be expected to increase by $80.7 billion over the same period, end quote. So which illustrates that value is created even in the not-for-profit sector, even if it's not always directly measurable in monetary terms, but instead it is assessed indirectly through savings in public health and by preventing economic losses for companies and nation states resulting from human absence and illness. So on the other hand, these animals also produce something else, namely what I propose as necrovalue, or non-human death, at least in a sense, by performing metabolic death work, which yields a certain form of value. So the phenomenon of necrovalue that emerges through metabolic death work differs in a decisive way from the phenomenon that usually is known under the notion of biovalue, while biovalue refers to the idea of creating a surplus value from vitality or from living beings. Necrovalue points to the ways in which death is sort of reimagined as a site of value production. So while in general the rule applies to the use of animals within capitalism that labor time equals life, both with synthetic produced mosquitoes basically work towards their own death and the death of their fellow species members. So it's not only their entire life that is subsumed under the logic of production, with death as the completion of both of life and labor, Instead, it is through their death that these life forms become truly productive. So what distinguishes these life forms from Barrua's and Vadivell's examples of animal labor, however, is then that in the case of the synthetically engineered mosquitoes, populations instead of individuals are killed. So as I mentioned before, farm animals labor on themselves up until death, which serves as the transition point where value can be realized. However, it is not the death of populations that holds value here. So in a crucial sense, the factory farm centers on harnessing life itself as a productive force. And despite the omnipresence of death, the factory farm still operates in a, or primarily operates in a biopolitical mode. So, or to put it with critical animal studies scholar Kerry Wolf, quote, "The practices of maximizing control over life and death, of making live, in Foucault's words, through eugenics, artificial insemination, and selective breeding, pharmaceutical enhancements, inoculation, and the like, are on display in the modern factory farm as perhaps nowhere else in biopolitical history," end quote. And this results basically in at least two crucial differences compared to the synthetically produced mosquitoes on hand. First, the killing of farm animals in the factory farm isn't an issue of killing as targeted reason, but rather of killing as an extension of economic rationality. So farm animals die as laboring bodies and as raw material that is killed to be turned into commodities before the next cohort takes their place. Second, precisely because death marks a material point of transition in the factory farm's commodification process, so where one animal body is killed and is replaced by another, the engineered mosquitoes sort of disrupt this cycle because the ultimate purpose is not the killing of individual members, but rather the termination of the species continuity. And this, however, represents a different kind of death compared to that of an individual in a slaughterhouse, for example. So one is an individual death, where the animal dies as a member of its species, while the other is a sort of collective death, maybe. The latter does not really extinguish only one being, but it extinguishes the ongoingness itself of the species. So meaning, while for farm animals, it is the case that labor time equals life, with life being taken in the end, in order to transform the animal body into a commodity, a somewhat more complex picture arises here. So the death of a population or an entire species might not be as carnal or tangible as the death of an individual that is rendered into, for example, meat or what else. Nonetheless, something is taken away from these synthetically engineered mosquitoes, which is not only their life, but the continued existence of their entire species, in theory at least. So the interplay of production and reproduction at the cellular level and at the species level becomes a generator of value here. But this is only possible if the organisms concerned actively contribute to this goal, namely through their metabolic labor. That is, through reproducing themselves in order to ensure their survival so long that they can pass on their genetic code to their offspring or to other mosquitoes, and the offspring eventually dies. So to say that these life forms function as metabolically working bodies, generating necrovalue in the process, however, should caution us not to mistake organisms as factories, or as what Stefan Helmreich, following Marx, says, or what Marx would have called, quote, means of production already produced, as though their productivity is the essence of their species being, end quote. So it is really important to stress that organisms are not factories. It is only within the framework of molecular biological appropriation and the genetic reprogramming of these mosquitoes that they become a vehicle for production of necrovalue and that they become a public health technology. So furthermore, despite that the temporalities of animal labor are different from those of human labor, of course, because they emerge from the rhythmic movements and from metabolic growth rather than from the chronometric division of the working day, the work performed by these mosquitoes in both presented cases still fulfills the purpose of increasing relative surplus value through reducing human labor time, in particular the labor time of the vector control specialists. After all, unwaged non-human labor embodied in surplus labor time contributes to the production of surplus value, as Barla reminds us. So therefore, if Mustapha de Bain is right in saying that from now on the engineered mosquitoes are doing the job for us, making human technicians obsolete, at least to a certain degree, he omits that it is not only the mosquito who works, even if they play an essential role, but the mosquito in the relation with a lot of other like human actors, for example, lab technicians, vector control experts, field workers, and other institutions. Finally, the engineered mosquitoes produce something else, something that could be called, following Luisa Reis-Castro, non-encounter value. So Luisa Reis-Castro, who's a Brazilian anthropologist based in the US, demonstrates through her intensive field research in the biofactories of Oxitec in northeastern Brazil that there is basically a paradoxical relationship at play here, where the mosquitoes must simultaneously engage with their wild counterparts in order to create non-encounters with humans, which is experienced then, or which are experienced as something that holds value or something valuable. Such non-encounter value, as Reis-Castro terms it, is the value which is created by these engineered mosquitoes through the promise of reducing or eliminating the risk of being bitten by these disease-carrying mosquitoes. So in a reversal of Donna Haraway's notion of encounter value, non-encounter value is not realized through direct human experience of interaction with the transgenic mosquitoes, but rather through the absence of such interactions. So the absence, which basically symbolizes health and safety. So following the practices through which the engineered mosquitoes are simultaneously cared for and killed in order to understand the ways in which ecological relations are transformed into economic ones, Reis-Castro's ethnographic research impressively demonstrates how value can be derived not only from presence and interaction, meaning from encounters, but also from engineered absence or death or loss. So ultimately, if we follow these considerations, something else becomes evident as well here, namely that in the case of the two synthetically produced organisms which I introduced, death cannot be reduced to a single factor. So death is simultaneously an event, so the abrupt ending of individual and collective life. It's a state, the absence of mosquitoes and the relations to them or with them, and the goal and activity towards which these modified organisms work, metabolically work. Okay, so now it's time to pull the strings together. I'm already losing my voice. So the laboratory has indeed become a kind of factory for the creation of new forms of life or molecular life. However, it is not only molecular life that is being produced. The two examples of synthetically produced mosquitoes I just presented highlight, or suggest at least, that new forms of molecular death are also being produced. So the emergence of synthetically produced mosquitoes like Oxitec's friend Aedes or target malaria's gene-drive mosquito then represents sort of a shift in the ways in which life and death are economized and put to work in contemporary biocapitalism. So these engineered organisms are not simply new commodities, or not just new commodities and novel tools in fighting public health challenges, but also emblematic of a profound reconfiguration of the very meaning and function of life itself under conditions of advanced biocapitalism. So as I've argued, these mosquitoes do not merely produce bio-value through the expansion, acceleration, and alteration of their vital capacities. Instead, they generate a distinct form of value that emerges from the technoscientific orchestration of death, transforming death into a source of value, which is natural value. So this dynamic points to the limits of the notion of bio-value, which tends to focus on the ways through which, as I said earlier, the generative, transformative potentials of living entities are harnessed and enhanced to produce value. So the concept of necro value, as I've proposed in this talk, by contrast, offers a lens that allows us to explore the utilization and also commodification of death in contemporary capitalist economies. complementing instead of replacing the notion of bio-value. Necro-value draws attention to the ways death can yield different forms of value and profit. So what is more, such perspective also complicates the argument that the role of animals as lively commodities is one where being alive is central to the production process. Because here, at least in this case, and maybe also in other cases, but at least these animals become only or truly productive as bearers of death, especially their own death. So the appropriation of the metabolic forces of cells and living beings to produce death on a molecular level, only to scale it up to species death, is a unique phenomenon. Neither does death make room here for new life, nor does it simply function as a necessary evil, and even less can it be regarded as a vehicle for analyzing life processes or diseases, as Foucault, for example, described for medicine in the 19th and 20th centuries. Rather, reproduction functions as a form of metabolic work that yields value through simultaneously producing life and making death. Instead of being exploited or killed to generate economic value, so as it is, for example, the case with so-called livestock or farm animals, or instead of just being eradicated in order to free space for humans, which happened in the past with other species, these mosquitoes are sort of characterized by something else, something that I tend to call making death through producing life. So in this sense, the synthetically produced mosquitoes also exemplify what Achille Mbembe has termed necropolitics, which is the politics of death that increasingly come to shape the governance of human life under conditions of advanced capitalism, and here also biotechnology. Instead of aiming to foster, optimize, and secure life, as in Foucault's classic formulation of biopolitics, these necropolitical projects are oriented towards the strategic deployment and management of death. The goal is not merely to sustain and enhance life, but to orchestrate its demise in ways that generate new forms of value and even profit. Okay, so I think I will close here because I'm already losing my voice. All I want to say is that what distinguishes these animals from other animals is that they really work towards their death, that they are put to work in order to eradicate themselves. And I think the notion or the concept of necro-value, which is really work in progress, I'm not sure how solid it is, but it's just a suggestion. I think it might offer an avenue to analyze the processes through which these organisms, which are turned into technologies, might contribute to the production of profit. So, okay, thank you very much.